So we've been back at our desk for almost 3 weeks now. And some of the conversations we've been having with people, we're asking whether are we not getting too much rain across the country? Because I mean, if you think of it, KZN, parts of the Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, even Limpopo, it's been raining throughout the December holiday. And even now, at the start of January going into February, it's been pretty much raining. And of course, there can be such a thing as too much rain for the crops. But I don't think this is a time for us in South Africa to worry much about the excessive rain. Because remember, uh, all of the crops that we are planting, particularly the field crops, which is the grains, the oilseeds, and the sugarcane, we typically need excellent rains from somewhere around October all the way to the end of February, and sometimes even through to March, because that's the period where the crops are at their growing stages and going on into the flowering or pollination stages. So throughout that period, you do need some sufficient moisture. But of course, you don't want it to all raining because we're not growing rice here. We're growing other crops. So some days of excellent sunshine do help. And I'll say this, at the start of the season, somewhere around November, end of October, there were areas where we were actually worried that it was raining too much and it was cold in the fields. So farmers weren't really receiving the excellent sunshine that we needed for seed germination. But if you think about it in the country now, sure, it has been raining, but we've had also some days where we get some nice sunshine. And I think that has assisted in making sure that at least the crops are growing fairly well. And anyone who has been driving across the country or even from your destination and coming back into your workplace, regardless of where we work in the country, you probably saw that the fields were well planted and the crops were looking good, which is something that we said in our previous segment of AgriView. And I think that's the whole point. We don't think that we should be worried a lot about the rainfall from now. But also remember, though, there is a cutoff date because from mid-March onwards, you do want to see that South Africa receives at least some warmer weather conditions. What will be different by that time is that a number of crops will actually be at the maturation stages. And when the crops mature, we need a bit of sunshine at that time so that we are able then to see the crop maturing well and forming better yields. Because if it continues to rain throughout, that can present some quality issues. I mean, many people who've been following our conversation will recall that earlier on AgriView, particularly when we were discussing the 2024-25 production season, there was a time where we were worried about the quality of our maize. And the reason for that is because it had rained throughout to the end of April. And at that time, it's when we required a bit of sunshine so that the crops can mature fairly well. And there was a quality issue on the maize at that time. I mean, we had white maize, about roughly 60% or so of it, that was the first grade. And then we saw a big chunk of our maize also being now graded as a WM2, which is on a second grade one. So there can be some quality risks if it rains too much at particular periods. But what matters the most now is when in the crop growing stages does it rain a lot. And remember, the reason I'm talking a lot about all of this rain is because a majority of our field crops are actually rain-fed. Depending on the rain, it's only roughly about 10 to 20% of our field crops that are actually irrigated. But of course, if you are talking about fruits and vegetables, it's a different story. All of that is under irrigation. And when it rains a lot and there's good soil moisture, it also does mean then that farmers, perhaps in some areas, do not need to irrigate as much. And that helps on saving at least the energy that is utilized on the irrigation side. But as we talk about all of this discussion of excellent rains in South Africa, we are in La Nina. I mean, even the La Nina weather forecast, they suggest that now we are continuing with the La Nina. But from March, we will start to see that it will be a normalization and the La Nina weakens. And of course, then getting into April, we're more on the normal stream. Under those forecasts, which we have from the Earth Institute at Columbia University, then that tells us then that from that period on, we can expect to have some normalization of the season. So there is science in this that actually backs this optimism that sure, good rains now, but perhaps maybe from March onwards, we will enter the type of a weather pattern that we need. But that's just the majority of South Africa. Because remember, there are also other areas, especially the southern part of the Eastern Cape and all the way linking to the garden route. I've been hearing from a couple of farmers there, in fact, some of them that are in the field crop growing areas, which were complaining. They were saying, look, a few kilometers from us, it's raining, it's lush and green, but we do have some areas that were not receiving as much rainfall as we need. And remember, the winter rainfall area in South Africa is primarily the Western Cape, not the Eastern Cape. So there is that belt in the southern parts of the Eastern Cape that hasn't been receiving rainfall. So we hope then that at least from February or so, those areas could receive some sufficient moisture so that the grazing veld can improve. Because remember, there's a lot of dairy in the Eastern Cape, but also there's a bit there of the sheep farming and also some that are on fruit and all of the other crops. But others can irrigate because the dam levels to an extent are healthy. But then if you are in the livestock farming side, you do need a bit of rain so that the grazing veld can improve. And that's, by the way, in South Africa, that improvement in the grazing veld, I would say right now, when you are thinking about the livestock industry, as we said in our previous segment, it's probably one of the few upsides that we are seeing in the livestock industry, which is this improvement in the grazing veld, because these rains are not only good just for crops, they are also good on ensuring that we see an improvement in the grazing veld, which then lowers the feed costs for the livestock industry. And of course, the other upside or positive for the livestock industry is that if you think about the maize prices today, the soybean prices, all of those are down, at least by the end of January, still down by roughly 30% from a year ago. And that is a huge benefit in terms of the feed cost, in combination, of course, with this improvement in the grazing veld because of these excellent rains. But of course, then the major challenge that the farmers in the livestock industry, even today, are still struggling with, particularly the cattle farmers, is the foot and mouth disease. And the core issue there is about South Africa's ability to be able to source the vaccines, and after sourcing those vaccines, making sure that we have the capability of reaching every farmer on making sure that we are able to vaccinate against the foot and mouth disease. It remains pretty much a difficult issue, and any South African that actually knows people that are farming in the Midlands part of KZN, you probably saw pictures that were coming up sent by other people that are in the dairy industry there over the December holiday, that those were not looking as good. And of course, we know that the beef farmers also are having their own challenges because of this. So South Africa's ability to be able to source the vaccine that we need and making sure then that we distribute, we prioritize hotspots, those are all of the things that will be important in ensuring that we see this solid recovery. So building from the message of last week, the core thing is that we should not worry about the rainfall. It is still assisting in field crops as well as in the horticulture, that is fruit and vegetables, also in the grazing veld. But the core thing then that will be needed is this vaccination approach in South Africa. And I think that the success of the vaccine is what will determine whether we see a much more stronger growth or recovery in 2026 of agriculture compared perhaps to what we saw in 2025. Because remember, the 2025 agricultural performance in South Africa was mixed, and what made it mixed is that the largest subsector of our farming industry, which is the livestock, particularly cattle farmers, were the ones that were under pressure at the start of the year because of higher feed costs coming from 2024, where we were affected by the drought, which led to a poor crop. And of course, the second half of the year, we did see those feed costs coming down. The second aspect, of course, then, was this foot and mouth disease. And the foot and mouth disease issue, by the way, the major thing is the fact that now we have certain export markets which we can't reach. And of course, then that on the finances of those farmers, it's a big challenge. But also smallholder farmers, we don't talk a lot about those, but many of them are really dependent on the auctions, on selling their livestock. Now, with this disease and certain auctions being stopped, that does mean then that there are few avenues at which the smallholder and the medium-scale farmers who are used to selling their stock in the auctions to generate some bit of income they are actually under pressure because of all of those dynamics that we are seeing in the industry. So a recovery from this foot and mouth disease is something that is very urgent on determining the pace and the path at which the South African agricultural sector will be going. But put all of this together, if you ask me a question of saying, okay, as a consumer in South Africa, what does all of this mean for me? I would say, look, this still point to a better path of potentially moderating food price inflation in South Africa. Because the essential message that I'm saying is that these rains are helping on the crops, on the fruit, but to a certain extent also within supporting the livestock industry. And the key thing is for us to vaccinate the livestock. And if we succeed on that, this points then to a better recovery in agriculture, better supplies, and of course leading to a moderate food price inflation, which paints a positive picture for the consumer, but also a positive picture generally when you are thinking about the employment condition in the South African agricultural sector. And with that, folks, let me stop there on this episode, and we'll come back evaluating a couple of things that are impacting the South African agricultural sector. And I would say we wouldn't have done all of these episodes to this point without the support of many of the partners. And some of the folks that are assisting us on delivering some of these insights are our friends at Nedbank, and for that, we're grateful for their support.